Good morning and Happy New Year, everyone. My name is Lana Hunt, and on behalf of IPMG, I would like to welcome you to the first Professional Development Workshop of 2016. Before I introduce today's guest speaker, who's going to be talking to us about supported decision-making, I'd like to just go over a few reminders. First is that we absolutely welcome any questions that you may have, so feel free to type those in the chat section of your webinar menu, and we will have time after the presentation to go over those. This training has also been approved for one Advocare external training credit, so if you are a case manager attending today, you can submit the confirmation of attendance email per the Advocare instructions to receive that credit. That attendance email will come from public relations that go to IPMG.com, so you'll want to watch your email for that, and you should receive that within 2 business days after today's presentation. If for some reason you don't receive that, please contact our customer service at the email address listed, and we'll take care of getting that to you. Also, within 2 days of today's training, we will be posting a link to the training recording, the associated materials, and the question and answer on our website, as well as our social media. And for everyone that registered and attends, you'll also receive that in an email. New for 2016 is that we are going to be asking all attendees to complete a survey just so that we can receive your feedback, any suggestions that you have. You will receive that following the end of today's PDW, and that again will also come to your email. So take a few minutes to complete that. We do welcome your feedback. Looking forward so that you can mark your calendars on February 19th, which is the next date of our PDW, we will be talking about supporting families across an individual's lifespan. And Ann Robertson, IPMG Senior Advisor and Owner, will be sharing information on ways that we can support individuals and their families throughout their life. And more information as well as the registration for that workshop will be coming soon. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you now our guest speaker, Jonathan Martinez. Jonathan is the Legal Director of the Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities and the Project Director for the National Resource Center for Supported Decision Making. He has over 20 years experience representing people with disabilities in cases under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, Individuals with Disabilities Act, and the Medicaid and Constitution of the United States. Additionally, he represented Jenny Hatch in the Justice for Jenny case, which was the first case to hold that a person with disabilities has the right to engage in supported decision-making instead of being under guardianship. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Martinez.
Good morning. My name is Jonathan Martinez, and thank you so much for the introduction, Lana. I want to begin with an apology and thanks. I'm doing this webinar from my home. I recently had knee surgery, so if there are technical problems or if you hear dogs barking or birds chirping, it is entirely from my end, and I apologize for that. But I want to thank Lana and Jennifer for making this work, and because of that, I'm going to be saying things like next slide please to advance the slides. Again, I want to thank them for accommodating me because I could not be in my office to make this work. And as I begin, let me tell you, we are going to be talking about supported decision making. Supported decision making, as you'll hear, is an alternative to guardianship, but it's more than that. It is a way to give people control over their lives and give them the opportunity to have a better life. But I make you a promise as we begin today. 2 promises, actually. The first promise is this. You will not hear me say that there should never be a guardianship. You will not hear me say that guardians are evil or that guardianship is somehow wrong. I will not say that. There are times when it is appropriate. The purpose of this conversation is to say there are other options that should perhaps be tried first. The second promise is I want your questions and your feedback. Please give it to me. I'm willing to stay as long as necessary after the presentation to answer as many questions as you all can throw at me and make myself available offline if you have any additional questions. So let's begin. And let's begin with something I think is a truism, which is this. You hear time and time and time again that there are no stupid questions. I'm here to tell you that's not true. There are stupid questions, and here's one. What is your favorite right? I want you to think about the things that are the most important to you, the things that make you most proud to be a human or an American or a citizen, and things like freedom of speech, community integration, supported employment, the right to live in the community and see who you want and assemble. What do all of these things have in common? Next slide, please. Next slide. Choice. Think about it. Choice is the linchpin of all of our rights. Freedom of speech, the right to choose what to say. Freedom of community integration, the right to choose where to live. Employment, the right to choose where to work. Choice, the right to make choices, is what makes us who we are. On your screen is a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, who is not known as the sunshiniest of writers, but he said this: I am my choices. I cannot not choose. My choices make me who I am. They tell us who I want to be, who I don't want to be, where I want to go with my life. Next slide, please. And clinically, we have a term for that. It's called self-determination, the right to make choices, the right to exercise choices. The psychologists call self-determination being the causal actor in our lives, doing things instead of having things done to us, making choices instead of having choices made for us, being the causal actors. Next slide, please. And what we've known, back one please, what we've known through study after study after study is that when people have greater self-determination, when they make more choices, they have better lives. This is not me talking. This is people with a lot of initials after their name, a lot more than mine, who have found by doing long-term studies that people with more control over their lives, who exercise more self-determination, are healthier. They're subjectively happier. They are more independent, more well-adjusted, and better able to recognize abusive situations and avoid abuse. They are safer. Next slide, please. So let me ask you another stupid question. Those rights that are important to you, the ones that you hold the most dear, are they worth anything if you're not allowed to exercise them? If someone says, yeah, I know you've got the freedom of speech, but you're going to say what I tell you to say, and I know you've got the right to choose where to work and where to live, but I'm going to tell you you're not going to work and you're going to live where I tell you to live. Are those even rights? Are you even a citizen if you can't exercise those same basic rights as everyone else? Next slide, please. And yet that's exactly what we've been doing. For 2,000 years, we've been doing that to older adults and people with disabilities. The second they have shown any type of limitation, what we have done systematically is we have taken away their rights. In ancient Rome, 2,000 years ago, if you were a person with a disability, or feeble-minded as they called it, you would be put under a curator who was empowered to make the decisions for you. In Britain, in feudal Britain in the Middle Ages, if you were an idiot or a lunatic, as they called it, and actually they considered there a difference between the two, you had a committee put over you to make decisions for you in the king's name. Next slide, please. Here in America, we call that guardianship. Guardianship, in most basic language, takes away your rights and gives them to someone else. The vast majority of guardianships, studies have shown even 90% of guardianships, are what they call plenary or full guardianships, where every single right, every choice is given to someone else. And that's even though state laws generally say that guardianship should be limited just to those areas where the person can't make decisions for him or herself. As one scholar has said, as long as courts have the option for full guardianship, they're going to use it because, frankly, it's easier to check all the boxes than it is to figure out which boxes to check. So 90% of guardianships out there are taking away all rights or giving someone else the ability to say, you will speak when I tell you to speak, you will live where I tell you to live, you will work or not based upon my decision. Next slide, please. And as a result of that, guardians over people who are vulnerable have ultimate power. They have often complete control over the most basic life issues, the most intimate life issues, finances, health, relationships. Guardians can make those decisions for someone else, making them what one scholar I know calls an unperson who has suffered a civil death, because that person ceases to exist in the eyes of the law. Think about it. If you cannot make a decision for yourself without someone else's okay, the law doesn't even recognize you, because you can't interact with society unless someone else does it for you. Next slide, please. So that is the ultimate in removing self-determination, making you not a causal actor, taking away your right to make choices. And the same studies that say how good it is to have self-determination tell you how bad it is to lose it. For 40 years, we've known that people denied self-determination will feel helpless, hopeless, or self-critical. To use one scholar's words, they, quote, will not behave because they see no point in behaving. They experience low self-esteem, passivity. It affects their ability to function, because when you've been told you can't do anything, why would you try to do anything? Next slide, please. Congress knows about this and has known it for 30 years. On your screen is a quote from Congressman Claude Pepper, who was the chair of the subcommittee on aging in the House of Representatives. This quote's almost 30 years old. It came from 1987. Congressman Pepper said, the typical ward has fewer rights than the typical felon. Having a guardian means that someone else has the power to say where you're going to live, what health care you're going to get, if any, and sometimes when you're going to die. It is, in his words, the worst deprivation of civil rights that can be put on an American citizen, short of the death penalty. Next slide, please. Let me tell you a story. This is the story of DINO and LILLIAN. This story was covered in the New York Times just last year. They're on your screen right now. That's them. DINO was a band leader in the 50s and 60s. LILLIAN came into his club. Often he liked the way she danced. She danced an elegant tango. They had a courtship, they married, and they lived together for 45 years. Next slide, please. And they did everything that we're told to do with our loved ones. They created an advance directive and a power of attorney that said, should something happen, God forbid, I want my husband or my wife to take care of me, to make decisions for me, because they know me the best. I want the person who knows me, who knows what I want, to say what is in my best interest, what should be done for me. And unfortunately, LILLIAN developed dementia. And together, they identified, and they went into what they identified as a great nursing home for her, one that was well recommended, that took good care of her. And there she was, and DINO came to visit every day, sang her favorite songs, brought her favorite food. Next slide, please. Till one day, DINO had some concerns about the bill and concerns about her care, and wrote a letter to the nursing home. And very shortly thereafter, what was waiting for him on his doorstep was a petition seeking full guardianship of LILLIAN, to put control of his wife's life into a stranger's hands. And when questioned about it, the attorney for the nursing home had this to say: guardianship is a legitimate means to get the nursing home paid. In a random survey of guardianship cases filed in New York, a surprising number, a shocking number, were filed by nursing homes. Not saying they were all in the same situation, but saying that this is something of concern, that this family had planned for this eventuality, and a stranger could come in just because of a dispute over a bill and take control of someone's life from someone who that person wanted in her life. Next slide, please. So where do we go? I promised you at the beginning, and I hold to that promise. I will not tell you there should never be a guardianship. Guardianship may be needed. Absolutely, there are times when a person simply cannot make decisions in his or her life, or chooses not to make decisions in his or her life, and puts his or her health, safety, and welfare at risk. And at those times, if we've tried everything else, absolutely, guardianship is appropriate. Next slide. But what I am here to tell you is that Guardianship is never needed just because you have this disability or you're that many years old or because you need some help, or the two worst reasons for guardianship. Well, it's always been that way. People like you have always had guardians, or it's for your own good. For your own good, because you need protection, you need help, because you can't, because we are going to take away your right to make choices for your own good. And that's just the thing. Very rarely do we see abusive intentions for guardianship. I'd like to hope that anyway. I don't think people set out to get guardianship by and large because they want to hurt somebody. They're doing it for their own good. They have the best of intentions. They mean well. Next slide, please. But here's the thing. When we mean well, that's when we've got to think about what we're doing. On your screen is a quote from the United States Supreme Court in a case called Olmstead, not the famous Olmstead case from about 20 years ago, but another one where it said that's when we have to be very careful. The greatest dangers to liberty exist when there are people who mean well but aren't understanding, when they want to help but don't know. That's when there's danger. So when you hear for your own good, when someone says to you, close your eyes, it's for your own good, that's generally when you're getting a shot. That's when you should be the most scared. So when you hear for your own good, my advice, run. Next slide, please. We must have meant really well. We must have had the best of intentions for a long time. I want you to do something for me. I want you to think back 20 years to 1995. Think about what things were like in 1995 for people with disabilities. If there are people on this call who were in grade school or high school or, God forbid, weren't yet born in 1995, I think I speak for everyone else on this call when I say we all hate you. Everyone else who remembers, I was only kidding about the hatred. I want you to think about 1995 and what things were like. 1995 was only 5 years after the Olmstead decision. Okay, so, I'm sorry, it was 4 years before the Olmstead decision. My apologies, the painkillers are getting to me. So at that time, it was still okay to warehouse people with disabilities in institutions. It was only 5 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act, so we'd had a lifetime of discrimination against people with disabilities. We didn't have things like Medicaid waivers. Sheltered workshops were the norm. Now think about today, 20 years later. Olmstead's a right. Community integration is an expectation. People have the right to live in the community. They have the right to those types of choices. Sheltered workshops are frowned upon, are the subject of lawsuits to give people with disabilities the chance to work in integrated employment. We have more Medicaid waivers. Heck, we have iPads that can take the place of $10,000 DynaVox communication devices. We have more supports and services today to help more people be more independent than ever before. So answer this stupid question. Why have the number of people under guardianship tripled in the last 20 years? That is 1 million more people estimated under guardianship today than in 1995. We've lost a generation. Why? And I think it's because we've meant well. We've had teachers telling parents, when your child turns 18, you must get guardianship. Doctors telling folks, you must get a guardianship because this person has difficulty understanding. Lawyers saying, get guardianship to help this person. And we mean well and we seek guardianship. But when we do that, as the studies have shown, next slide please, we have put people in a situation where they lose their self-determination, and we know that leads to negative life outcomes. Here's a study from 2010. Said people under guardianship, particularly those who are under what I call overbroad or undue guardianships, guardianships people don't need or that take away too many rights, have a significant negative impact on their physical and mental health, longevity, ability to function, and reports of well-being. In other words, they live shorter lives. They are less healthy. They are less happy. And they are less able to function in society. By meaning well and taking away rights, we are doing the exact opposite of what we wanted to do. Next slide, please. On the other hand, though, Study after study has shown that increasing self-determination leads to better life outcomes. For older adults, those with more self-determination are better able to adjust physically and psychologically to increasing care needs. Now think about how important that is for someone with a progressive disability like dementia. They are better able to adjust as they need more care. For people with disabilities, those with more self-determination are more likely to be employed at higher paying jobs, be more involved in their life decisions, more involved to live in the community. They have a better quality of life. Next slide, please. This is the study I always show to people when they say that guardianship is for protection. This study showed that women with intellectual disabilities who are disproportionately likely to be the victims of sexual assault, it's a horrible situation, but they did an experiment where they gave women with intellectual disabilities more self-determination, more opportunities to exercise more choice and more control over their lives. And what did they find? That the ones who had that, who had more self-determination, were better able to recognize potentially abusive situations, and as a result, better able to resist and avoid abuse. They were safer. So if you want to protect someone, don't take away their rights. Empower them. Give them more choices. Next slide, please. And this is the one I consider the kicker, because this study just came out. The National Core Indicators Study is a national study, state by state, with data collected in every state by every state. Indiana was a participant. And what they look at is a number of variables about a person's life and their quality of life. Just one of the variables they looked at was whether or not a person had a guardian. Now, this was an apples-to-apples study. They looked at it in the old-fashioned way of IQ. They're looking at people who have mild, moderate, and severe disabilities across the board, with only the question of, do you have a guardian, as part of the National Core Indicator Study. And what they found across the board for people with the same abilities and limitations, with the only difference being whether or not you had a guardian, that those without guardians were more likely to have a paid job, live independently, have friends other than family and paid staff, go on dates, and practice the religion of their choice. Now, if you believe in community integration, this has to be a revelation, because the only thing standing in between people of similar abilities and similar limitations, the only thing making them more or less likely to have friends, the only thing making them more or less likely to have a job, is having a guardian. Next slide, please. So where do we go? Where do we go from here? As I said, people often have increased care needs as they age. And if we know that some people who are older or some people who have disabilities do in fact need more support, and we know that guardianship, when it is not necessary, reduces a person's life outcomes, and we know that increasing self-determination increases or improves life outcomes, then here's what we need. We need something that will provide people with the support they need while also increasing their self-determination. Now, let me tell you another story. Next slide, please. This person you see on your screen, her name's Jenny Hatch. Jenny is a regular person. I resist calls to call her a hero or an angel or a superhero, because she's not. When I met Jenny, she was 29 years old. She has Down syndrome. She had graduated high school. She had her own apartment, lived independently in the community. She had her own job for 5 years. She'd been working in the same job, making regular wages, paying regular taxes. She was politically active. She was a volunteer on many campaigns. She had many friends in the community. She was well known, and she was well liked. And then she had the bad luck to be in a car accident. And after being in the car accident, her parents moved for guardianship and said, you should live in a group home where we tell you to live, and you should see who we tell you to see. Next slide. When I met Jenny, she was already under a temporary guardianship. And what you see on your screen is the last paragraph of a 10-page order telling the guardians what they could do. And I tell you, this was a horrific order. There were 4 separate paragraphs saying the guardians could say where Jenny could live. This person who had her own apartment, including they could put her in an institution. There were 3 separate paragraphs saying what, if any, health care they could ensure that Jenny got, including a paragraph saying they could take her off medication or withhold health care and withhold CPR if they wanted. But this is the last paragraph. Take a look at that. The guardians have the power to make decisions about who she sees, what kind of support she gets, what kind of health care, what kind of safety, what kind of habilitation or education, what kind of treatment she gets, and where she lives. Looking at those words, can you tell me this? Did Jenny have any rights left? Did this person who lived and worked independently for her adult life have any rights left? Was she even a citizen? And I asked the same question that you're probably asking. Why? Why did they do this to her after 29 years? Next slide, please. Well, there was a psychologist who reviewed Jenny, and she testified. And this is what the psychologist said. She said, Jenny's going to need assistance to make decisions about her life. She's going to need assistance to help understand where to live and what to do and to do banking and law. There's a bunch of quotes on this. But this is essentially it. She will need someone to guide her and give her assistance. Next slide, please. And you know what? They were right. Talk to Jenny at any time. You know that Jenny needs support. Jenny needs help to understand legal issues. She needs help to understand medical issues. She needs someone to help her out when it comes to monetary issues. And she needs some support in her day-to-day life. Do you know what that means? Next slide, please. That means Jenny's a person. Is there a person on this phone call who does all things and all decisions in all ways for him or herself? Is there a person I'm talking to today who never needs any help, who never needs any support, who never goes to a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant because they got it all knocked? If there is, please give me your email. I could use some help because we're all Jenny Hatch. She always said to me time and again, I don't need a guardian. I just need a little help. And I said, amen. We are all Jenny Hatch. Next slide, please. So we needed to show a judge that we're all Jenny Hatch. We need to show a judge just needing help, just needing someone to guide us and give us assistance does not mean that we cannot make our own decisions. And we showed that judge a way forward called supported decision-making. And what is supported decision-making? 29 slides into a presentation entitled Supported Decision-Making. Well, it's on your screen. It is a recognized alternative to guardianship where people with disabilities use trusted friends, family members, and professionals to help them understand the situations and choices they face, so they can make their own decisions without the need for a guardian. Next slide, please. Or, as the National Guardianship Association calls it, and I have to tell you, the National Guardianship Association is a national organization by guardians, for guardians, made up of guardians, dedicated to good guardianship practice. They say that supported decision-making is a process where an individual with challenges is the ultimate decision maker, but has provided support from other people to help that person understand. Next slide, please. That's a whole lot of words. So I want you to do this. I want you to think about it. When you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you a bunch of jargon and talks about subluxation in your cervical area that can be treated conservatively with anti-inflammatories or aggressively with an intervention, or you go to an accountant to do your taxes and they talk about itemized versus depreciated versus, basis points, or you go to the auto mechanic and they talk about blown head gaskets and you don't get it. It sounds like a foreign language. What do? You do what I do. You go to someone who knows better. Or you say, can you please explain that in English? Can you please help me understand? You go to your brother, the accountant, or your sister, the lawyer, or your friend, the auto mechanic, and say, explain this to me, help me understand. You go to Google and do some research. You get the information that you need to make the best decision. You know what you've done right there? You've engaged in supported decision-making. You've gotten help from trusted friends, family members, and professionals to help you understand the situation or choice you faced so you could make your own best decision. You've done it. You engaged in supported decision-making. Next slide, please. So that's when I say this. I tell people all the time, supported decision-making is just a whole bunch of words for what you and I do every single day. We get help when we need help, but there's a critical difference here. When you and I do it, when I ask for advice, I'm being smart. I am getting assistance. I'm being wise or judicious. When Jenny Hatch, a person with Down syndrome, says, I don't understand, please help me understand, we all just think she's dumb. We think that because a person with a disability or an older adult says, I need help doing something, Society says, well, that must mean you can't do anything. And then guardianship comes in, and we take away the right to do everything, all because we mean well, in the face of all those studies saying that actually hurts a person. Next slide, please. And you know, just like you and I get help to do things, Jenny'd been doing it for years. I had her case manager on the stand. The case manager talked about how Jenny did her plan of care under Medicaid. And I said, well, how in the world could this person who can't understand things sign this 20-page document? How could she do that? And they said, oh, we explained it to her. We went page by page. Jenny was the central figure in her care plan. And we went through it and explained things to her. And when she understood it, she signed it herself. And that she signed it herself was a refrain in her case. How did Jenny consent to surgery? And her parents said, we explained that informed consent form. We helped her understand. We went over it. And it wasn't until that she understood it that she signed it herself. Jenny had signed a 40-page power of attorney full of legal jargon about stock options and bankings. And I said, how in the world did she sign that? And they said, we took her to the lawyer. And the lawyer spent time explaining it to her, making sure she understood it so she could ask questions. And it wasn't until we were sure she understood it that she signed it herself. So Jenny had been engaging in supported decision-making for years, just like you and I do. Yes, she needs a little more help to understand things. She needs a little more explanation, but it didn't mean that she didn't understand because they said she did. Next slide, please. So after 6 days of trial, after having experts come in from around the country testifying live or remotely about how important it was to have self-determination, we had a closing argument, or I think you can probably guess. I pounded the law on the table and the facts and gave half-assed oratory for 45 minutes, and the judge said, I'll come back and let you know. And I told Jenny, I think we're going to lose because I just thought for 2,000 years this is what we're doing, but we are going to fight it. And we're going to appeal it. And the judge came back and started reading. And the first 5-10 minutes of what he was reading was all about why Jenny needed a guardian. And I kept saying, Jenny, we can fight this. And she kept saying, he's going to send me home. And she was smarter than me because about 5 minutes in, the judge said, however. And I will tell you, as a trial lawyer, no lawyer wants to be on the wrong side of however. Because what the judge said was, yes, we are going to put her under a guardianship for 1 year. And it's going to be the people she wants. Not her parents, but she wanted to live with friends, and they're going to be the ones, and they're going to look after her for only 2 things, safety and health care. Everything else, she makes her own decisions. That's only going to be for 1 year, and that 1 year ended in August 2014. Jenny Hatch has been living guardian-free for 18 months now. And the judge said, next slide, please, most importantly, he said it was the guardian's job, like it is every guardian's job, to assist her in making decisions using supported decision-making, helping her make her own decisions, because it's the guardian's job not to make decisions for the person, what they think is in the person's best interest, but to help the person make the decision he or she would make, he or she wants to make. Next slide, please. So what that meant is that day, after 6 days, after being in a group home for a year, Jenny Hatch got justice that day, and that's one of my favorite pictures, so I always pause for a second. It is one of my favorite pictures because there's Jenny in the front, happy because she's going home. She knows that day she doesn't have to go behind a segregated group home anymore. And that's me behind her looking my absolute best in soft focus. I always appreciate that picture because someone says, you look like Al Pacino, and I say, thank you, soft focus. Next slide, please. Why did Jenny get justice that day? It's a question I've always asked myself, and I ask my audiences, because it sounds so easy. Jenny got justice. So I'll tell you why she got it. First, because she's awesome. She never gave up. Lots of people in her situation would give up, because she was told for a year, this is your best interest, Jenny. Don't fight it. You're going to live here. She says it herself. She was told, get used to your new life. You're not going to work where you want to work. You're not going to go to your church. You're not going to see your friends. Get used to your new life. Most people would give up. Jenny had support. The people who became her guardians, now her supporters where she lived, her employers, they thought so much of Jenny that when no one would take her in after the hospital, including her parents, they said, come live with us. And she lived with them, and they became a family, and they've been living together for over 4 years. And she works with them, and she lives with them, and she has gone from a segregated group home to a room overlooking the pool. Jenny has spoken in New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and she and I are going to Idaho and Washington in this summer. She's gone to Disney World as a guest to speak on guardianship, all because she had the courage to fight. But it was more than that. She had support from national experts who came out to say that this is wrong. The ARC of the United States, the National Association of Mental Illness, the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law came out and fought for her. The ACLU was a great supporter. She had national experts come out. She had a judge who was willing to listen and learn, who at the beginning of the case said, he had a cousin with this kind of condition and would want his cousin to be protected, evolving all the way to saying 1 year and 1 year only, and then you get to do it for yourself, and guardians should use supported decision making. So all of those things added up to Jenny's justice. You know what that means? Next slide, please. It means that Jenny got lucky. No doubt about it. Jenny was lucky. Take away any of those things. Take away a judge willing to listen. Take away national experts. Take away her friends who spent thousands of dollars on their own attorney. I was Jenny's attorney. They had someone else representing their interests, all because they love Jenny. Jenny got lucky. Take away any of them. She's still in that group home. She's behind barbed wire fence. She's working in a sheltered workshop, making less than $1,000 over 8 months of almost 40-hour-a-week work. She got lucky. So next slide, please. And that's a lesson that I want you all to remember. The lesson that DINO and LILLIAN and Jenny teach us is that our right to make choices, the rights that you hold the most dear, should never depend upon your luck, should never depend upon who you know. Justice and self-determination are something that we are born with. The right to make choices is the most basic right we have. Jenny Hatch had to fight for a year to get the same rights that we all hold dear, that we all think are basic to citizenship. Next slide, please. So where do we go from here? Well, one thing I want you to do for me is to think about capacity, because capacity is the phrase that's most often used in guardianship cases. Does the person have capacity to make his or her own decisions? Well, I'd say to you, we all have different levels of capacity. Some of us can make some decisions all the time. Others of us can't make a decision unless we have more information, and we might need to talk to a doctor before making a medical decision. Some of us can't make decisions at all sometimes. Some of us get so stressed out we don't want to deal with things, or some of us have mental illness that sometimes render us unable to make our own decisions unless we get help. And what we know from studies is that when people have less opportunities to make decisions, they don't do it very well, because decision making is a skill. So we all have different levels of capacity. So think about it this way. Next slide, please. If a person can only make decisions with assistance, or if a person needs support to make decisions, is that person incapacitated and in need of a guardian? Are you? Because there's some decisions I guarantee you that you need help to make. So what I'm getting at here, next slide, is before seeking guardianship, before recommending guardianship, before deciding that a person does not have capacity to make decisions, what have you tried? What else have we tried before we take that ultimate step to guardianship so that we are sure that guardianship is truly needed? What other efforts have we exhausted? That's a fantasy of mine, by the way, and I do have law-based fantasies, that there will be cases where people, and they will say to that judge, you know, this person needs a guardian, and everyone will be on board with it. The person won't know to object. The guardian ad litem won't know to object. Everything will be hunky-dory. And that judge will say, wait a second. What else have you tried? Have you tried supported decision-making? Have you tried something else? And if the answer is no, case dismissed or case continued. Come back after you've tried something. That's where we should be. Next slide, please. Or, to put it another way, as the National Guardianship Association says, and again, a group made up of guardians, by guardians, for guardians, they say this, that alternatives, including supported decision-making, should always be identified and tried before seeking guardianship. So try something else first. Next slide, please. Because here's the thing. Supported decision-making can help. All those things that we talk about that show a lack of capacity, supported decision-making can help, just like they help you. They can help you understand the situations you face, weigh your options. They can help you think about the decisions you have to make so you can make sure that the decision you're making is actually what you want to do. And they can help you communicate your decisions. And think about have you never said to a friend of yours, I can't make this person understand what I'm saying. They just won't get it when I explain it. Will you please help me out? That's a form of supported decision-making. Next slide, please. And now 45 slides in. I know what you're thinking. How do I do this? What's the step? What's the process? What's step 1, step 2, step 3 of supported decision-making? And I'm here to tell you there isn't one. If someone tries to sell you a supported decision-making flowchart, you must do this first, you must do that second, run. Because every person makes decisions differently. Every person has a decision-making voice that is different from everyone else's. It is a paradigm, not a process. What supported decision-making says is that you have the right to make choices. And there's no one-size-fits-all to support us in that way. Supported decision-making can be something informal. It can be a listening ear. For one person, it might be recognizing that he or she likes to talk to a brother before making decisions. For other people, it might be more formal methods like the use of a power of attorney or a planning device or a plan of care or an advance directive that says, the person says in writing, when I am faced with these types of decisions, I want that person to help me, and I want it done in this particular way, laying it out for the world to see that I want help, and here's how I want the help given. And in some cases, it can be something really formal, like a formalized circle of support, or what we call a micro board, like a board of directors that meets regularly and is there to advise the person on what the decisions he or she has to make. All of these are forms of supported decision-making. Next slide, please. And that's what I want you to recognize, is that supported decision-making can be what best fits that person. And here's what any form of supported decision-making has in common. First, supported decision-making at its heart says this: every person has the right to make choices the same as every other person. You got that, you've got supported decision-making, because if you make that decision, you get yourself in that headspace, then the only question left once you make that determination is, what does this person need to make that happen? If you have the right to make choices, what do you need to exercise that right? And it has to recognize that some people can receive support in making their decision without giving up their right to make choices. That the need for help in making decisions does not mean that you cannot make decisions. And that a person can need assistance in making their choices or communicating their choices in many different ways. And if we have that, if we get in that headspace, then we have supported decision-making. Then supported decision-making exists for older adults and people with disabilities the exact same way it does for you and me. Next slide, please. And going back to self-determination, where I said we know, and we've known for decades, that self-determination improves life outcomes, the studies are actually quite promising. There are long-term studies right now into supported decision-making and self-determination. As you can see on your screen, preliminary results are that supported decision-making does, in fact, increase self-determination. It stands to reason, does it not? If self-determination is the ability to make more choices, supported decision-making, which empowers that, would increase self-determination. And if self-determination equals a better life, and supported decision-making equals more self-determination, then I say, just like the National Guardianship Association says, we should try this first. Next slide, please. And to try it, we have opportunities all around us. And I'm going to talk about a few of those in a second, but look at your screen. All of these things are opportunities for supported decision-making. When we're talking about person-centered planning, or student-led IEPs, or informed choice, or informed capacity, or end-of-life planning like 5 wishes, all of these are supported decision-making examples and opportunities. Next slide, please. Let's talk about some of those that you might be facing and some of the people you work with. And one of the best places to see supported decision-making in action is in education. I know it sounds weird. People don't seem to realize that education and decision-making can and should go hand in hand. But think about it. On your screen right there is part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the law that creates special education. And it says the entire purpose of the IDEA, the whole point, you look at the bold words, is to help prepare children for further education, employment, and independent living. It is on the school to help kids with disabilities become prepared to live independently without needing to have someone make decisions for them. That's their job. Next slide, please. So when we talk about self-determination, that is one of the main points of education. It is a best practice, as one study said. Schools should focus on improving students' abilities to set goals, solve problems, and make decisions, because that is the essence of independent living. It's also an incredibly important part of education. So if schools aren't focusing on those type of things, they're not doing their jobs. And if we're at IEP meetings advocating for kids with disabilities to get appropriate services, that's what I always hit them with. What are you doing to improve my kid's chance to live independently? What are you doing around decision making? And that's incredibly important, because next slide, even with that law saying that schools should be preparing people for independent living, studies repeatedly show, including one last year that I was a part of, that the number one referral source for guardianship, schools. Even though schools are obligated to talk about independent living and empower independent living, when people were asked, where did you hear about guardianship? Number one resource, schools. It was the school. And I hear it all the time. The teacher told me that my kid was turning 18, so I had to get guardianship to be involved in education. Next slide, please. So I say this, through education, we can close the on-ramp to guardianship. We're working with kids in special education. The most basic special education service is the individualized education plan. And it can be an exercise in supported decision-making and self-determination, because the IEP planning meeting, best practices call for the student-led IEP, where the student is at the meeting. Hell, the student's at the head of the table. Student leads the meeting, and the parents and teachers and professionals are around the table. And as the student gets older, the student is supposed to take a leadership role in the process, not just being there, but leading the meeting, identifying the people to speak, talking about goals and process, and everyone works together to help the student understand what the student needs and make the best possible goals and objectives for that year. Next slide, please. Doesn't that sound just like supported decision-making? They're all around the table. They're helping the student understand. The student makes decisions. The student leads the meeting. The student receives the input. That's supported decision-making in a laboratory setting, helping that student understand the decision-making process and get better at it, helping the student move closer to an independent life. Next slide, please. And we close the on-ramp as the student gets older through transition services. I'm sure a lot of you are dealing with those kids in that transition period, teenage to the early 20s. Well, schools have a different obligation for those kids. They're called transition services. There's a whole plan supposed to be in place for providing transition services, which are supposed to help kids transition to post-school adult living objectives and, when appropriate, acquisition of daily living skills. Now think of for a second what the vast majority of times people seek guardianship are. You can't live on your own. You don't have the skills to live on your own. You can't make decisions on your own. And ask yourself, looking at that language, looking at the school's obligation to provide transition services, is it not the responsibility of the school to help make the child get those skills, to help learn about independent living skills, including decision-making? Next slide, please. It's why I get so angry when I hear that schools are recommending guardianship, because transition starts at age 16 and it goes until up to age 22 in the schools, meaning you've got at least 5 years. Some states it's 7. Some states start at age 14, like District of Columbia. And you have those years to get transition services. So when I hear that a school at age 18 is saying you need a guardian, I always ask the same question. What in the hell have you been doing for the last 2 years? for the last 4 years. If you've had concerns that this student cannot make decisions for him or herself, what have you been doing to address that so the student can live independently, which is the purpose of the IDEA, or who can transition to the acquisition of daily living skills under transition services? If a school is not providing specially targeted services for that, they have failed in their obligation. Next slide, please. So when we use schools, schools should be closing the on-ramp to guardianship. If there's any concern that a student cannot make decisions or might need a guardian, we should be asking schools to provide appropriate transition services to help that student acquire the daily living skills he or she needs to live independently. That is our first opportunity to help children become self-determined, to help them live independent lives. Next slide, please. But there are so many others. And I apologize for running through these so quickly. I can usually spend a day on each of these, and I'm perfectly happy to speak to any of you offline if you have questions. But the next service I think is so important is called Vocational Rehabilitation. Every state has an agency that provides vocational rehabilitation, or VR, services. And the whole point of the VR program is to provide supports and services to people with disabilities to help them prepare to get a job, help them get a job, help them advance in their job, or help them keep their job or regain a job. It's all about employment. Anything you need to prepare for, gain, advance in, retain, or regain employment, you can get through vocational rehabilitation. So what does that have to do with supported decision-making and independent living? Next slide, please. Well, what if the exact same things you needed to get a job are the things keeping you from living independently? What if the very things that people would normally say would make you need to go into guardianship are the things that you need to work? What if you have problems with employment-related skills like caring for yourself, or organization, or communication, or everyday living skills? What if you can't make those employment skills happen? Next slide, please. And yeah, I know. You're asking the same question vocational rehabilitations ask me all the time. What do you mean those are employment-based skills? What do you mean self-care is an employment skill? Or what do you mean independent living is an employment skill? And I ask them this question: would you hire somebody who can't communicate with your clients? Would you hire someone who can't get along with their coworkers? Would you hire someone who can't show up to work on time, or who has such bad health habits that he or she is always sick and missing work? Of course you wouldn't. So if these are the things that are keeping someone from working, next slide, please. If these life skills limitations are keeping a person from working, then the VR organization has an obligation to provide supports and services to help a person overcome those limitations. Next slide, please. And I can tell you that VR has unlimited services it can provide. I have gotten VR agencies to pay for rent. I have gotten them to pay for clothing, because how can you get a job if you don't have good clothing? How can you get a job if you have no fixed address? How can you get a job if you have poor health? They can provide just about anything, including education services to help us make decisions better. But the first step is becoming eligible, and I'm sure you have lots of people you work with who you think could benefit from this program, and I promise you they can. Well, to be eligible, it's the easiest thing in the world. You have to have a disability, want to work, and you have to be able to benefit from the VR services. That means be able to work if they will help you. And that's it. If your person is getting SSI or SSDI, they are considered eligible. They are presumed eligible. So eligibility is easy. In fact, they have to prove you're not eligible. You don't have to prove you are eligible. And before they say you can't work, they have to give you a chance to work. They have to help put you in a job, or you get an opportunity to work to see if you can do it, or what help you would need to do it. So eligibility is the first one of the most important parts. Next slide, please. And once you're eligible, you get access to a plan called an Individualized Plan for Employment, or IPE. And the whole point of that plan is to help the person identify what job he or she wants. And VR can help you get assessments and tests to see what jobs you might be interested in. And the whole point of that plan is the person says, this is the job I want. And the person says, these are the services I need to help get that job based upon the limitations that I have that are keeping me from getting that job. All the person having that opportunity. Next slide. And the key part of that, The key part of that process is what's called informed choice. With informed choice, the counselor's job is to help the person understand what he or she needs, what limitations he or she has, so the person can make the best possible decision to find the best possible supports and services. Next slide, please. Doesn't that sound like supported decision-making? Doesn't that sound, the counselor helps the person understand, the counselor helps the person learn, the counselor helps the person make a choice. Next slide, please. And there are so many other examples which we're going to fly through right now. I know we only have a few minutes left. Person-centered planning in Medicaid. If you're working with someone getting Medicaid or Medicaid waiver services, the rules already require supported decision-making. They call it person-centered planning. Plans have to be made with the person at the center of them. They have to include people important to the person. They have to include issues important to the person and say what is important for and to the person so that they're sure the services are exactly what the person wants and needs. Doesn't that sound like supported decision-making? Next slide, please. And as people age, we have the opportunity to make plans that will help make it easier for them. We can undergo life planning. Instead of saying we're at a situation now where we have to get guardianship, we can plan for things. We can assume that people will need more support as they age and put a plan in place. I've written these. I know there's lots of words on your screen. We're going to go through lots of them pretty quickly. I'm happy to talk to you offline. But think about it this way. What if I was to do a plan with someone, if someone was to do a power of attorney that says, when I'm not able to make decisions for myself, when a doctor says my situation has progressed to the point where I can't make decisions, I want this person over here to be my decision maker like DINO and LILLIAN did. But until that time happens, what I want is this person to be my supporter. I want this person to help me make decisions and be part of my team, or these people to be part of my team. And we can see that happen in a number of situations. Next slide, please. Think about medical decisions. Okay? We typically think about an advance directive as giving someone else authority, where we say, you know, when I can't do it, I want you to be my medical decision maker. Well, what if we added that second paragraph down there that said, if I can't make decisions, I want this other person to do it. But until that time, I want to make my own medical decisions with your help. I want my supporter to help me understand my medical choices, to be part of my medical team. So when I go to the doctor, that person can come in with me. And I can put in that advance directive a statement saying to my doctor, I waive my privacy rights with regard to my medical records so that you can talk to my friend, my sister, my parent, so we can be part of a decision-making team. Whenever I talk to doctors about that, they say, how can that happen? HIPAA says we can't do that. I said, of course you can. Think about every time you go to the doctor, you sign a HIPAA release that tells the doctor that they can give your medical records to someone else. Now, if all we did was handwrite in there, and can discuss my medical records with that person to help me make decisions, you've just created a supported decision-making plan. Because not only can the doctor give your records and discuss your case, they can now bring you into the room and help you make decisions. That's supported decision-making. Next slide, please. And it works in finances, too. We see all the time with older adults and people with disabilities the risk of financial exploitation. Well, what if we created a plan that said, that recognized that risk, but also gave the person opportunities to make choices for him or herself up to a certain level? What if we said it is okay to spend up to X dollars on your own for whatever you want, $100, $200, whatever. Anything over that, we've got to get approval from the supporter, and there are actually banking apps that allow you to do exactly that. A double-sided check allows you to do exactly that. But look at the bold language. My agent will give primary consideration to what I want to do, the decisions I want to make when deciding whether or not to be a part. We've created a team. We've protected the person from exploitation while giving the person maximum independence up to his or her best level. Next slide, please. We see the same thing in banking, where we can create joint accounts, where we can say this person can withdraw X amount of dollars on his or her own, but not more than that without a second sign-off, not more than that without approval from the supporter, showing once again that the supporter has to give primary consideration to the person's interests, but protecting the person from spending too much, while also enabling the person to make more decisions for him or herself. Next slide, please. As we get older, We do end-of-life planning, and there are programs like called 5 Wishes or The Conversation that give a person power over their end-of-life decisions, where we have a guided conversation. You know, what do you want as you get older? What kind of measures do you want taken should you have a life-threatening illness? In your memorial service, what songs do you want played? We're giving a person power over something that we are all powerless over, and the studies show that leads to a greater sense of self-awareness and self-contentment, even in the face of death. Next slide, please. And the last thing I'm going to talk to you about in plans is what I call a growth clause. So I put these in all of my plans and all of my powers of attorney. It's really simple. It says that people change as they get older. And if we're going to put limits on a person's ability to make decisions, we should review them regularly. It might be that if we give a person the power to spend $100 on his own, next year the person might be good enough to spend $200 or have enough financial discipline to not need a second check on it. So we're going to review that. We're going to have a growth clause. Every 6 months or so, we're going to look at this agreement and see if we can change it. A person might need more support as they age. It allows the plan to be a living document, helping that person make decisions all the way through. So as we close, I want you to do a few things for me. Next slide, please. First, please never forget DINO, Lillian, and Jenny. Supported decision-making and the right to make choices only works if we respect. If we look at people as people, first and foremost, not as diagnoses, not as ages. People, you're not Down syndrome, you're Jenny, who happens to have Down syndrome. And we respect people's right to make choices. If we do that, we're well on the way to appreciating and improving self-determination. Next slide, please. And I realize that's a challenge. I told you when we began that for 2,000 years we have been assuming people can't make decisions, and we have been taking away rights. And I get this from doctors and lawyers all the time when I do this presentation. They say, you are asking us to change the way we've always done things. And I tell them, yep. Every great advance in civil rights, by definition, changes the way things have always been. Think about it. In 1775, it had always been that America was the property of Britain. In 1862, it had always been that some people had the right to own other people. In 1917, it had always been that women didn't have the right to vote. And in 1989, it had always been that people with disabilities had little to no rights. We changed the way things have always been, and the world is better for it. Next slide, please. And I know that change is hard. Choice is hard, because with choice comes risky choices. People are going to make choices you don't agree with. They're going to do things that you think aren't in their best interests, and they're going to do things that are harmful or difficult, and that's not easy. I know it's hard. On your screen is a quote from my favorite author. We were not promised that it would be easy. The purpose of life is not ease. The purpose of life is to choose and to act upon our choices. In that way, we are not judged on our outcomes, but on our effort, our daring, and our resolve. Amen. We're not judged on the outcome of one decision, but on who we are at the end. My mom always told me that when we go to the pearly gate, St. Peter only asks one question, and that is, what did you do with what we gave you? And if your answer is, I chose, I made choices, I respected other people's choices, I think we did okay. Because we know that choice makes life. And if what we do with our life is we make the tough choices, even the ones that others wouldn't agree with, then we've done well. Next slide, please. In the end, I ask that you remember the goal. Every person has the right to make choices. Every person can be the causal agent in his or her life. Yes, people with disabilities and older adults might need more help, but we all need help. And it's on us to make sure that help is available and appropriate. We all have those same rights. And if we do that, next slide, please, I will no longer be talking about rights. We'll all be talking about choices. We'll all be saying, what choices did we make, not what choices did someone else make for you. It won't be a what can't you do, but what can you do and what did you do, and isn't it great that you did it? And then the questions that we ask won't be so stupid anymore. There'll be questions like, what do I want to do today? And where do I want to go? And who do I want to see? And how do I want to order my life from now on? And when we do that, we'll be exercising the rights that are the most important to all of us. And those rights will be equal rights. It's been my honor to talk to you. Like I said, I'm very happy to answer any questions. That's my contact information. That email on the bottom is how you can reach me. I'm one of those weird people who consistently checks email first thing in the morning, last thing at night. So I make you the last promise, which is if you email me, I will respond to you. And with that, Lana, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Wonderful information, and I'm sure that we do have some questions. So we will take some time now to go through them. Okay, just a little bit of. Well, first, obviously, we have very many comments saying that the information that you've presented is amazing and that they appreciate the information very much.
Well, I can agree with that. I'll answer that question. Thank you.
Someone is asking if there are different types of guardianship. I know you had talked about, okay.
There are many different types of guardianship. And actually, what most laws say is that guardianship should be tailored to the person, so that even if guardianship is needed, it should only be in the area a person needs. So for example, let's say that a person with disabilities can make any decision that he or she needs to make, but just doesn't get money. And that's my godson is that way. He has an intellectual disability. He's pretty good at making all decisions. He can't figure out money. So in that situation, the proper move is to have a guardianship only over financial situations. Some states call that a conservatorship. The problem is even though that's the common sense move, the studies say that doesn't happen. 90% of guardianships are plenary. They take away all rights even when they don't have to. So you know what? I think, if we look at guardianship the way I think we're supposed to, that it's a last resort and it should be limited only to the areas they're needed, I don't really have a problem with it, as long as we say to ourselves that guardianship should be limited in scope and possibly in time. Because if the guardian's job is to help the person make decisions, and as we saw from Jenny's case, and as we see from the National Guardianship Association, that guardians are supposed to empower the person, then a guardian should be helping the person make decisions and master the skill and use supported decision making, and then go back to the court and say, you know what, Judge, I did my job, fire me. If it worked that way, the way I think it's supposed to work, I'd be fine with guardianship. It just doesn't work that way. And the studies show that we have a lot more DINO and LILLIAN cases, and we have a lot more Jenny cases, before the verdict than we have anything else.
Absolutely, thank you. Someone is asking if the nursing home got their way and did take away Lillian's husband's ability to make decisions for her.
At the end of the article, it was in that situation. I know they were fighting it. Obviously, court records are sealed, and we haven't been able to get in contact since then. But that was the original very sad ending to the story. But the story ended with DINO saying he was going to keep fighting.
Thank you. I know we were all, but I'm sure, rooting for that type of outcome. Someone is asking if you have any resources that could direct us to guardianship statistics by state.
And you know what, I don't, and that's one of the biggest problems with guardianship. There aren't any. Is that states are not required to keep that data. And even the study that I told you that said the estimated number of people under guardianship has increased by 1 million, has to caveat that with, we don't have centralized data. We actually don't know where the people under guardianship are. So the stories are, when we, to find out data on guardianship, you literally have to go through court files, one at a time, the ones that aren't sealed. It's one of the great calls for guardianship reform is to require some kind of the states to keep track. In Virginia, for example, where I am, you're supposed to report to a particular state agency regarding the guardianship, but they're not required to make data available. So no one person could say there are 10,000 people under guardianship and 9,500 are plenary. The studies that are out there are people who literally went through case files one at a time. They're very good studies, but I cannot give you definite national data or state data, and Indiana, to my knowledge, does not have a centralized data either. It is definitely something that would vastly improve the guardianship system, if for no other reason, because we know that the state was keeping an eye on it.
Absolutely. Next question is asking, and I know this is a very sensitive but necessary discussion topic. When an individual with or without a guardian chooses to be sexually active, but parents and other members of their support team do not feel that that's in their best interest, how should, and in this case, they're asking about a case manager, how to advocate for that individual's choice? Any suggestions on that?
I do. I have plenty of suggestions because we get that a lot. And again, it's hard for me to answer this without sounding like I'm slogging on parents. So the way I always say this is that I know that the first obligation of any family is to protect their own. I get it. But here's the thing. We make bad choices every day. Every one of us. If there is a single person on this phone who has had nothing but good relationships, again, I want to talk to you. I need your help. Because our bad choices, including our bad relationship choices, are making us who we are. It is a very scary thing to take away a person's right to choose who to be intimate with in a physical or emotional way. And unless a person has been found to be unable to make choices at all, it is not for someone to say that a particular relationship is not in a person's best interest. There was a case in New York very recently where a person with Down syndrome wanted to get married, and the parents fought it. Parents moved for guardianship saying, we don't approve. We think this is not in his best interest to be married. And what the court said is, that's not the point. The point is not whether you parents love your child. We know you do. The point is not whether you parents could make a better decision than the child. The point is whether the child can make that decision with or without support. And it's not for us, a court, or for anyone to say that you who can make decisions are making a bad decision and therefore you are not allowed to make that decision. So I always ask people to think about it through analogies and think about the decisions, the bad ones that we all make and how they've made us better. My grandfather loved his scotch. And we would say, Grandpa, that's going to kill you. And if you make the bad choice to drink and drive and get arrested, you're going to go to jail. There are consequences for every choices that you make. And he said, I like my scotch. I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to drive. And it makes me feel better to drink it. And who were we to take away a simple pleasure? Now, if the person we're talking about is making such consistently bad relationship choices that he or she is being abused, that he or she is being exploited, then that might be evidence of a lack of ability to make decisions or a need for protection. But if it's just someone who wants to experience sex, then what I say to parents is, I know that this is your child, and I know that this is always going to be your child, and I know that intellectual disability makes us see people as forever a child. They're not. My godson, who I told you about, is in his 30s now, and he is a playa, P-L-A-Y-A. In fact, he has a lot of girlfriends, and he keeps telling me that this is the one. And you know what? Good for him and good for them. They're living their life. They're making choices. We may not agree with who they date, but with every choice they make, they get a little better at making choices. And it's not for me to take away someone's intimate choices just because I'm uncomfortable with the idea of someone who I see as forever a child doing something that I equate with adulthood. The last thing I would suggest is when a parent's worried about that, I ask them to think about their own relationship choices and how they got to where they are. Because if choosing who to be intimate with and making a bad choice results in losing the right to make that choice, then think about who's been divorced. If you've been divorced, it seems like you made a bad relationship choice. Are we going to take away your right to make another one? Of course not. We're going to hope that you learned from that choice and got better. And relationships are like every other choice. They just happen to have sex involved. Sorry for the long answer, but it's something I hear a lot, and it's something that really does get my goat, because people with disabilities are adults, and too often they're treated like children. And I think it's one of the great stigmas that we have left. You know, it's what leads to what I call inspiration porn, stories about the brave person with a disability overcoming the odds. Then we don't look at them as people. People make choices, including bad ones, and people want to have sex. We always have. We're wired to it. And unless that choice is leading directly to physical harm or directly to abuse, it's not for us to take away that choice. Again, sorry for the length, and I hope that helped.
No, thank you very much. That does help. And I will just say that in May, for our May Professional Development Workshop, our guest speaker will actually be speaking on this topic in depth. So I'm very excited about that. Dr. Mary Wheeler is a professor and expert on working with individuals with intellectual disabilities and sexual expression. So please stay tuned for more information. Again, that will be in May of this year. Jonathan, question, and I think this does come up quite often, especially for those that are helping support individuals in a professional way, that oftentimes when we start working with those individuals, they already have had a guardian appointed. And do you have any suggestions or recommendations, one, for when the individual disagrees with their guardian or vice versa? And also kind of maybe talk a little bit about the process and what it involves to undo a guardianship that's already in place.
Yeah, and this is going to be a bit of a long answer. Again, I apologize. I don't have Indiana's law in front of me, but most states, and I think Indiana's, talks about maximizing the self-determination and independence of the person under guardianship. So that's the place to start. If a person is if a guardian is saying, I get to make these choices and the person doesn't, I wonder what the choice is. I was in Kentucky, and I heard about guardians refusing to let people under guardianship get earrings. You know, that kind of a really simple choice. Now, I'm the guardian. That's the choice I get to make. So the first question I want to know is, number one, is what does the guardianship papers say? Does it in fact say you can make all decisions? So ask the person to give you a copy of the guardianship papers. Sometimes they are in fact limited. And what's supposed to happen is the guardian's only supposed to have the powers spelled out in the guardianship. So it may be that you have one of the rare limited guardianships. The person doesn't have that power. But if you've got a situation where a guardian is consistently refusing to give the person, you know, to listen to the person, to give primary consideration to what the person wants to do, to give, you know, the person options, then I think that guardian's not doing his or her job. And I think that leads to a situation where the guardianship can be removed. And you have to ask yourself whether that's the kind of thing, you know, you think is appropriate. If there is, there are resources out there. Indiana has a protection and advocacy system for people with disabilities that I know has done some guardianship work. You can contact them. You can contact me, and we can talk about strategies. But I have to warn you, it is significantly harder to undo a guardianship than it is to avoid one in the first place. You know, these things tend to be self-perpetuating. It's why I focus so hard on things like special ed and voc rehab and stuff to avoid guardianship in the first place. Because once you're in, typically the standard for getting out is what they call restoration. The laws will say if a person is restored to competency, the guardianship can be removed. Now think about if you're a person with a disability, a person with intellectual disability. Restoration means cured. You know, the thing that was standing in between you and making decisions has gone away. We're never cured of that. an older person is never cured of dementia. So you've got to think more creatively. Can that person exercise supported decision-making? Does the person have a decision-making plan in place? Do we have evidence of it working? And we can maybe go back to the judge and say it's no longer needed because while the person didn't have a plan at first, now we do. I'm involved in a case at the Supreme Court of Texas asking to do exactly that. But again, it's hard. It's really hard, and it's the kind of thing where I'd have to spend hours, looking at a case and talking to you about the law. But the best advice I can give is once you get in, getting out, it's really hard. And in that situation where the guardian is consistently refusing to listen to the person or to, empower the person, about the only thing you can do is ask that the guardian be removed legally. Beyond that is just trying to convince the guardian to do the right thing. I know that's not a very optimistic answer, and I'm sorry, but it's one of the reasons why I think we have to be super careful before entering into guardianships.
Yes, yes. I find this question to be interesting and maybe not something that I have thought about, but if a person does have a guardian and the guardian passes away, would that person then be considered emancipated?
No, I wish it was that way. What I tell parents all the time when they're asking about guardianship is I said, you have to realize that you're not the guardian. The court is. The court is the person's guardian. You're just the person given the power by the court to make these decisions. If the court doesn't like the decisions you make, they can put another guardian over a person. I've got a case right now was covered by the Washington Post where I'm working with a person to try to get him out of guardianship. When the kid turned 18, the parents got the standard full court press. You have to move for guardianships. They never wanted it, but they were told you have to, so they became his guardians. And as time went on, they realized that this guardianship wasn't necessary. He could make decisions for himself. They wanted him to. Excuse me. So they went back to the court and said, we should remove this guardianship. He doesn't need it. And the court said, well, if you don't want to be the guardians, I'll find someone else. That's what they were faced with. And the same thing happens with the situation you just pointed out. When a person is under guardianship, if the guardian passes away, the court appoints someone else, possibly a stranger in the DINO and LILLIAN case. You can't leave guardianship in a will. Ultimately, the court decides who the best guardianship is. It's why one article I read says the majority of people under guardianship who have intellectual disabilities will eventually wind up with a stranger as a guardian. DINO and LILLIAN's case, someone who doesn't know Lillian, who doesn't know what he or she likes or would want, doesn't know her favorite activities or favorite foods. It's just going to be a stranger saying either do what you got to do to the nursing home or saying, you know what, I don't think Lillian should be eating those foods. They might raise her cholesterol even though they're her favorite foods. And then the person becomes even less of a person. So again, that's why I say the best remedy to guardianship is not entering in the first place.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. When you talked about supported decision making as a process, someone is asking if there's a way to fund that without guardianship. For example, they've said in the context of a Medicaid recipient.
I think so. I think you can fund it through Medicaid. I think you can fund it through Voc Rehab just by properly discussing what it is we're talking about. But think about Medicaid waivers, okay? If you've got a Medicaid waiver there in Indiana that is designed to help, increase independence and avoid institutionalization, it's supposed to cover the services and supports that you need to live in the community. So what if the problems you have are around self-care or around decision-making? You can, through in-home services and supports or daily living skills or activities of daily living therapies, get those kind of things. I mean, it just really comes down to how you word it. If you've got a kid under 21, the EPSDT Medicaid program, Early and Periodic Screening, Diagnosis, and Treatment, can absolutely help provide self-determination skill building because that's a cause. The disability causes the decision-making limitations that can need to be addressed through Medicaid. It just comes down to how you word it. And I think you need to think broadly about the types of services and supports. I wouldn't necessarily call it a supported decision-making arrangement. I would say to myself, okay, what problem are we facing here? What is the problem that we're facing piece by piece, and how can we make it work? So let's say I've got someone who's at risk of guardianship, wants to work with mom to help make financial decisions. Well, absolutely, financial planning and financial independence are things that can be covered through not only Medicaid waivers, but also voc rehab and benefits planning through the Social Security Administration. Okay, so as part of those planning processes, you say, I want to involve mom, or I want to involve this person to make this planning process work. You've just created supported decision-making in that arena. We can do the same thing around medical care, medication management, employment skills, etc. So piece by piece, you're creating the supported decision-making network.
Thank you. That's a really good way of looking at it, because with the individuals that we support that do receive Medicaid waiver services, looking at it through that person-centered planning process and what services and supports are available to them that could assist them with learning and supported decision-making. So,
absolutely.
Let's see. This person is saying that it is what they're asking is a hard question to ask, but hoping that they ask it correctly. How can one help or protect a naive, loving, caring, intellectually challenged person from individuals or from professionals that think they know best, or from scam artists, or people that are out to, I'm going to assume, exploit that person?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that question. And it's one, I think it's a perfect question to end on, because it lets me end on a sermon, which I'm sure you're incredibly tired of hearing at this point. But here's the thing. Your question is one I get all the time. How can we make sure a person without a guardian is protected? How can we make sure that if we use supported decision-making, someone's not going to get exploited? How can we make sure the person won't get exploited by his or her supporter? And my answer is you can't. You can't. I will not guarantee you that supported decision-making will protect a person from every situation. I also will not guarantee you that guardianship will do that. I get this all the time. When people talk about guardianship, I say, okay, protection through guardianship. Protection how? What is a guardian? Is a guardian bubble tape around a person? Is a guardian going to be with that person all the time to make sure this person never gets in any trouble ever? Of course not. It doesn't work that way. These are not the guardians of the galaxy, okay? But through supported decision-making, here's what we can do. We can increase skills in decision-making. We can increase opportunities for good decision-making. And what the studies show is that with opportunity comes improvement. And with self-determination, like I pointed out in my presentation, comes a better ability to recognize and avoid abuse. So while I cannot promise you that people will not be abused or exploited if they don't have guardians, I also cannot promise you that people won't be abused or exploited when they have guardians. I think DINO and LILLIAN's a good example of that. So if I'm given those two choices, if I'm given a choice between an imperfect solution to a definitely imperfect problem, here's what I'm going to choose. I'm going to choose the one that is most likely to increase self-determination, because self-determination is correlated with increased safety and protection, whereas lack of self-determination is not. So given my choices, I'm going to choose the one that increases self-determination, because that can make people safer. That's not a satisfying answer, I know, because people want guarantees, and there are people out there who are going to push people to make bad decisions. And again, I always use the analogy here. What about you in your life? We all have competing pressures. As I told one parent, if the determining factor of whether we have the right to make choices is whether we always make good choices and whether there is no one in our lives who will push us to make bad choices. If that's the determining factor, none of us have the right to make decisions. We all have friends who encourage us to do stupid things. Okay, if that's the determining, I need to stop playing poker because my friends get me to do stupid things. And yet that's part of life. So there are going to be people out there who aren't nice. There are going to be people out there who are exploitive. They're already out there. They're exploiting people under guardianship and not under guardianship, people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And if someone you're working with is at risk of abuse or is being exploited, we all are mandated reporters. We go to Adult Protective Services. And if a person is truly in need of a guardian and unable to make decisions even with support, then guardianship is appropriate. But barring that, every person has the right to make choices, including risky choices, including bad choices, including choices that are the result of someone influencing them. That is life. And that is the way that we all grow. So sometimes there aren't happy endings. I wish there were. But I am not here to tell you that supported decision-making is a perfect solution and will lead to a perfect life. It will not. What I believe it will do is lead to a better, fuller life where everyone has opportunities, including the opportunity to make a bad choice. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I know that you had said that you would like to end on that question, but if you wouldn't mind, quite a few people have asked and would like to know what has inspired you or made you do what made the decision to do what you do in regards to supported decision. And I think that would be a great way to close if you could just share with us your inspiration for being involved in this.
Well, I am only too happy to answer questions that allow me to talk about myself, because there are a few things in this world I like better than my own voice, and if you want to hear it, it's good with me. In my life, I grew up in this area. My uncle Bob, had cerebral palsy. And I've only heard this full story in the last couple of years, and it still always affects me. When Uncle Bob was born, when it became very clear that he had severe, what they called at the time, spastic cerebral palsy, apparently the nurse went to my grandfather and said, in cases like this, what we often do is we leave the child by an open window, and nature will take its course. And my grandfather ran and got a pediatrician immediately. And, Uncle Bob was not left by an open window. But before being discharged from the hospital, the pediatrician said to my uncle, that my grandfather, that, there's places for people like this, that they'll be cared for, and you won't have to worry about it until nature takes its course. And my grandfather took Uncle Bob home, put an addition on his house. And, he had the first ramp in Valley Stream, New York, to get Uncle Bob in and out. And Uncle Bob did all kinds of things. I went to a New York Knicks game once, and there's Uncle Bob near courtside, Ladies loved him. He had a great life. And here's the thing. None of this struck me as special, because there was nothing special about Uncle Bob. He was just a guy at my dinner table. On holidays, he was there. He had a great sense of humor. And because even at a time when people were warehoused, my grandfather insisted on Uncle Bob getting an education. Uncle Bob, who had control of exactly one finger, by the way, could use a letterboard to spell. So he could have a conversation. He could tell jokes, and it was just, that's the way it was. Here was Uncle Bob. He loved to laugh. He was funny. He couldn't talk. He needed help eating. There's nothing special about it. And that's, I guess, what has shaped this. It's why I always talk about supported decision-making is just us being us. There's nothing special about the way my Uncle Robert lived his life, except that my grandfather said, you have a right to live your life. You have a right to live your life and not have other people tell you what you can't do. I've been doing disability law for over 20 years. It's really the only thing I've ever wanted to do other than play left field for the Yankees or rhythm guitar for the Rolling Stones. And since I'm too short and Keith Richards is never going to die, I think I made the right career choice. And with regard to supported decision-making and guardianship, it wasn't something I'd ever really thought about. And I was in the protection and advocacy system in Virginia for almost 15 years, and no one ever really talked about guardianship. Because, again, society thinks it's generally a good thing, and it was never really in the conversation until I met Jenny. And they came and, the employers, the supporters came and found me and said they heard about you, and they're just a friend of a friend, and talked to Jonathan. And she changed my life. Because there's this young woman who, like my Uncle Robert, had a life. Did what she did. She worked and she lived, and she had limitations like we all have limitations. And she had the opportunity to live her life the way that we all have an opportunity to live our life, getting the help we need. And someone else decided that she shouldn't have that. Someone else said, get used to your new life, don't go to your church, don't see your friends, don't go to your job, for no other reason than that they could. And, the rest, because of one incredibly brave young woman, is history. And I think when you think about it in those terms, when you think about the right to make choices, then there is a straight line from every single one of us to Jenny Hatch. We all have the right to make choices in the best way that we can. And it's only when someone else says, you can't, that we lose that right. Because we're born with it. Someone else assumes that we can't without saying, what do you need to make it happen? I always say about Jenny, she heard you can't, and she said, watch me. And she's still doing it. So if she can do it, everyone can do it. And everyone should have the right to do it. And like I said, there's a straight line from Uncle Bob to the founding fathers who believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to you and me, and to Jenny Hatch and everyone else. And if we follow that line, then we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So thank you for asking that. It's an amazing story because the people I'm talking about aren't amazing. Uncle Bob and Jenny, they're not amazing. They're just living their lives. What's amazing is that society doesn't want them to live their lives or doesn't want to help them live their lives. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. And I know based on the many, many comments that we have received saying what an excellent presentation this was and how much they appreciate the information that you shared, we've all learned so much today, and I know we'll be able to take this and move forward in helping and supporting the individuals that we work with in making choices and living the self-determined life. So thank you so very much. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. Again, we will be posting the recording along with the slides and the question and answer within the next 2 days. You'll also be receiving that if you registered for today's presentation. And again, don't forget, you will be receiving a survey as well, and we do appreciate your feedback. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing and talking with you in February. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.